Us. And we'll be right back.
Coming up, immense wealth, extraordinary power, and relentless tragedy. What some have come to call the Kennedy curse, when our Dateline special continues. A family of power, privilege, and pain. As each new generation of Kennedys has taken its place in the political and social arena, so has each been visited by tragedy. The sadness behind the celebrity, when our Dateline special continues. Our Dateline special, John F. Kennedy Jr., continues.
Theirs is an American story of epic scale, the Kennedys of Massachusetts. It begins with Joe Kennedy, a man of Irish immigrant stock who built a financial empire and gave birth to a political dynasty. The Kennedys would seem to have it all: wealth, power, and a glamour that rivals Hollywood. And yet, they can't seem to escape the pain they are going through once again tonight. Here's John Hockenberry.
In the blink of an eye, we return to a place as familiar as it is tragic, as frightening as it is fascinating. The Kennedy curse. One family's tortured history again draws a whole nation together to experience a feeling of family. Their loss, our loss. Losses that mark the last half of the century now ending.
My family photo album in my head is shared by a lot of people. So it's an unusual sort of connection to have with other folk.
Unusual, but a connection that extended around the world. European papers are filled today with talk of the Kennedy curse. It was, in fact, 30 years ago this very day, in these waters that claimed John Kennedy's single-engine plane, that Americans looked up from their summer vacations to learn that Ted Kennedy, anointed many thought to carry the Kennedy torch back to the White House, was involved in a tragic accident at a place called Chappaquiddick.
I regard as indefensible the fact that I did not report the accident.
The scandal would end the presidential ambitions of a fourth Kennedy son, Kennedy chronicler and biographer Ralph Martin.
When do you think Americans began to think there was a such thing as a Kennedy curse?
I suppose Chappaquiddick. The thing about Teddy was that he really had it all going for him before that.
The Kennedy curse seemed to say that each heir to the riches and power of patriarch Joseph Kennedy would be struck down. First, Joseph Jr., killed in a military plane crash during World War II. Ralph Martin says chillingly that Joe volunteered for a dangerous mission because he was jealous of his younger brother Jack's exploits as a war hero in the famous PT-109 incident.
The older brother, it was the first time that he was not the center of the attention of the family. One of the family friends found him crying in frustration because of Jack. And it was that night that he went abroad.
Then JFK, carrying the torch for his dead brother, made it to the White House, only to be killed by an assassin's bullet in Dallas. John Jr. may not have held many memories of his father, but he well understood the charismatic role his uncles now would try to assume.
The president is a leader. He's expected to have abilities and a bearing that is different than the average guy. Otherwise, you know, anyone could be president.
Then it was Brother Bobby's turn to rise to the challenge others had taken before him.
Only those who dare to fail greatly can ever achieve greatly.
He carried the Kennedy torch without having to be told, struck down in 1968, once more by an assassin. The torch weighed heavily on next in line Brother Teddy, reading the eulogy at Bobby's funeral.
As he said many times, in many parts of this nation, to those he touched and who sought to touch him, some men see things as they are and say, why? I dream things that never were and say, why not?
Then there were the other tragedies along the way. Kennedys who carried no torch, but reminded us that this was a family that seemed to like living on the edge. Pushing limits, finding limits.
Sister Kathleen Kennedy, her nickname Kick, killed in 1948 when her small plane flew into bad weather. JFK's sister Rosemary, the victim of a failed lobotomy, institutionalized since the 40s. JFK's third child, John Jr.'s little brother Patrick Bouvier Kennedy, lived only 2 days, dying the same year his father was killed. There was Bobby's son David, who died of a drug overdose in 1984. His son Joseph involved in a car accident which paralyzed a female passenger for life. There was the rape scandal and acquittal of William Kennedy Smith. And most recently, Michael, another of Bobby's sons, killed on New Year's Eve 1997 in a risky game of football played on skis. Risk is built into this clan, put there by the father, Old Joe, who believed in winning above all else.
It was win-win-win. You couldn't lose. Everything you did, you had to win.
Maybe it's not so surprising that they have their share of tragedy.
It is the tragedies that have kept this family in the hearts of Americans. But old Kennedy hands like Frank Mankiewicz say it's admiration, not pity, that draws Americans toward them.
They respect action. They respect an eagerness to join the battle. And I think that is very admirable. And as long as they have that and share that, I don't think they're going to flee from it. Even though it brings them from time to time together to mourn.
There's a familiarity to the Kennedys. It's as though we all have our connection to the big family that runs the town and lives up the hill. Despite all the scandal and the misery, we know who they are. John Jr. understood that full well.
We all might say things and wish for a different result, but fundamentally Americans go with what is familiar to them.
And the Kennedy torch, if it was passed to anyone, it was to that little boy of our memories. Memories once again of the waters off Martha's Vineyard, the young son of a fallen president who could dare to dream the old Kennedy dreams. He even gently chided us all for watching the misfortunes of people who sometimes dare to reach for more. We can all gather like urchins at a hanging to watch those poor souls who took a chance on fantasy and came up empty-handed, to remind ourselves to keep the safety of the middle path.
The dynasty is still there. The family is still intact. They love each other. They stay together, and it's like us against the world.
Which is how this loss for a family is our loss. This curse for a family, a nation's unshakable misfortune. Another funeral, another heartbreaking, macabre, fascinating look at a family's too familiar pain. Another painful look inside ourselves. Where does the torch go now?
Despite the tragedy and scandals that have touched this family, the Kennedys have set the standard for public service. Of the 85 or so surviving members of the Kennedy clan, virtually all of the adults have devoted at least some time to public service endeavors. Joining us now from Hyannisport is a man who has known and written about the Kennedy family for years, New York Daily News columnist and NBC News consultant, Mike Barnicle. And Mike, this family is famous for strength in times of crisis, and you saw it again this weekend, didn't you?
Yes, Stone, that's correct. And it's almost surreal to think of the burden this family has carried through nearly 50 years of sometimes wonderful triumphs, but terrible, terrible tragedies, and they're doing it once again on this July weekend in 1999. And I think the source of their strength has to be this deep faith that they have in their religion. And now the deep faith that they have is twinned with trying to figure out what fate has again done to this family. So the combination of faith and fate has been a constant here for years and years and years, and it's been put into play again this evening as they wait for what appears to be the inevitable news that John F. Kennedy Jr. is dead on Nantucket Sound, a few miles from here.
In a column you wrote today, you talked about the fact that at times like this, the family has turned to Ted Kennedy for guidance and direction, and yet, ever since his mother's death, JFK Jr. has assumed something of that role as well, has he not?
I think John Kennedy Jr. did assume that somewhat of that role among his peer group, among his cousins. But here, in this compound behind us, these two homes behind us, there is a Ted Kennedy that we don't see on network television, that we don't read about in the great newspapers of this country. And it's the Ted Kennedy who has been a surrogate father to all of these many children from 1963 and 1968 onward. There are very few birthdays that he has missed for these nieces and nephews. There are very few graduations that he has missed.